Well, let's get some questions here on the show. Let's get some questions here on the show. This first one sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from George Moranville.
George, how are you, George? An old. Nah, he's not that old. He's so old when he was a kid, the Dead Sea was still sick. Old-time wrestling fan from Lexington, Kentucky, back to the Weasel Dooley days.
Can you speak a little bit about Keith Mitchell now that he's announced his retirement? From his experience dating back to World Class to finishing his wrestling career at AEW and all points in between, wouldn't a book by Keith be an invaluable piece of history to leave the wrestling community?
Yeah, I love Keith Mitchell, and it would be a great book, but Keith is such a nice guy. I don't know if he'd want to knock anybody, so I don't know if it would be juicy or scandalous or anything like that, but Keith started on the World Class program in the early 80s in Dallas. He was part of the TV crew there that, Mickey Grant started
That's right.
at Channel 39 in Dallas. For years, the World Class Television in Dallas was on KTVT Channel 11 from Fort Worth on Saturday nights. It was a 2-hour program, 10 to midnight. Most of the time, a higher viewership than Saturday Night Live. And it was shot from the Will Rogers Coliseum in Fort Worth on Monday nights because they had the show there weekly on Mondays. And honestly, it was not a high energy program. I mean, I think one match we had one week on the Monday night show was Dennis Condrey versus Johnny Mantell in a cold singles match, 2 out of 3 falls. And when I say cold, I'm talking about a cold match with no angle behind it, and also cold because it was like February, and the Will Rogers Coliseum was a cattle exhibition hall, and Jesus Christ, it was cold in there.
Nothing like a Mark Lawrence at 11 p.m.
Oh, boy, I tell you what, I'm surprised. That just shows how over wrestling was and how over the Von Erichs were at that time, that this was a wrestling show, but besides the interviews with the heels, it was a fairly slow-paced wrestling show for 2 hours. And Mark Lawrence, wonderful guy, great guy, but he was not a fireball personality. So it was a kind of a snooze fest. But the point is, that's the television that they had for years to promote the live events. But then, and everybody who's seen the World Class documentaries, has heard this story, but just briefly, Channel 39 was an independent station. It was owned or operated or affiliated with the Christian Broadcasting Network in some fashion, which sounds crazy that they'd get in the wrestling business, but that's when, Fritz was the Christian and they had a world-class chaplain and that whole thing. So somehow Fritz and World Class being a big deal in wrestling in the Dallas area, Mickey Grant and some of the people that worked at 39 thought, well, we can do something with this program. And they had a great production facility there. So anyway, that's when the world-class syndicated television show that people know today, that they saw in the 80s, that they've seen clips of mostly on documentaries and DVDs, came into being, was around, 1982-ish? They started it? 83?
I think 81.
80. Well, you know what? As a matter of fact, it was because it was in on the ground floor of the Freebirds Von Erichs angle and program. So all of a sudden, and that's where...
And it was never World Class Wrestling before then. That was where the name World Class came from.
Right. It was Southwest Sports was the name of the company, and it was just wrestling.
Big time wrestling.
Big time wrestling. So anyway, that's where everybody started going crazy over this program because they were highly relying on the handheld cameras. They were getting in the ring, close-ups. They were shooting it like a sporting event. They had the guys mic'd for good and bad. You could hear sometimes some guys saying things they shouldn't, but a lot of times, once the guys were smartened up to it, the smart ones would work with it. Like that, they told us when we first got in, hey, the microphones are up your ass, cameras are everywhere, so always be on. So you could get a lot of the manager giving the heel, the pep talk in the corner type of thing. But the TV show, it was shot well. They had from the Sportatorium in Dallas, which was a much better atmosphere than the building in Fort Worth. They started using more main event matchups because, you know, it was really taken off and the territory was hot. And that television program was kind of the cutting edge of wrestling television production, even past Crockett, who had a bigger territory, was taking in more money. They had bought the Nemo truck and were doing tapings in the arenas at that point, but they didn't have that one location like the Sportatorium that all the Carolinas crowds were always enthusiastic, but they just, not only did they have the crowd there in the Sportatorium, they were from Dallas, they had the TV station behind them pushing for the syndication, and it just got hot and took off. And that program at one point was behind only Vince's in terms of overall national syndication until, you know, Crockett got heavy involved in trying to expand. And Keith Mitchell was a director and producer and was on that crew and went from there, not directly, but pretty much straight away, when Dallas was, you know, on its last legs, went to WCW, and Keith was part of the television crew for WCW under TBS from the late 80s through pretty much the demise. And so, and most all of it was not his fault, folks. And then, because obviously he had so much experience, he knew everybody, he had worked with all the top guys. Jeff Jarrett and when they started TNA naturally wanted Keith, and Keith worked for quite I guess until probably the year before TNA got started, or before AEW got started. Keith was still with TNA. We had talked to Keith when Sinclair was buying Ring of Honor. And we said, okay, we can also get you the best, you know, TV wrestling producer, not currently working for Vince McMahon in the world. But then we found out that Sinclair wanted to pay a director and a producer together less money than either a director or a producer would earn if they were doing the job anywhere else. And so Keith did not come to be a part of Ring of Honor television. He gave us some advice. I can say that now because he's retired. And we didn't, obviously he was still with TNA, so we didn't publicly admit that. But we were trying to, you know, I found out how much he was making there and went to Sinclair and said, we can have this guy and he can open up. He did WCW's television. Will only be limited by the budget as to what we can do. He knows how to do everything. And they offered him 30%, 40% of what he was making in TNA to do his job plus the director job as well. Well, they didn't offer it to him. That's what they were going to pay. I didn't ever pitch that because I'd started talking to him when I thought they were serious. Anyway, so, and then obviously because Tony wanted to Tony Khan replicate as much as he could of the WCW look on the Turner networks, because that's what they were going for. That's when they actually apparently offered Keith what he was worth, and he went to work there. But after 40 years, I'm not surprised he's retiring. I don't think it had anything personal to do with the wrestling business as much as just, yeah. Because I've quoted this many times, but Keith Mitchell is the one famous for, if he's the producer in the truck, when the last match would come up, he'd go, and now, ladies and gentlemen, to all the people in the truck, the match we've all been waiting for, the last one. We all get the fuck out of this truck. But I loved, and Keith had brought in to TNA Dave Sahadi, who worked for Vince for years, because Lou Sahadi, his father, was a wrestling writer for Wrestling World magazine and did a variety of stuff with the business in the 60s. And then Dave got involved in television. He's the one that wrote all those tremendous voiceovers and the cold opens of the pay-per-view packages during the Attitude Era. And back in those days, it were really dramatic and just a television whiz. And Keith brought him down, and he was on the crew for a while. And Keith and Dave were the two main reasons why the best part of TNA for most of those years was the quality of their television program in terms of the production, not the content, which is kind of like the same thing here with AEW has been. It's a major league television show, just some of the stuff they put on it didn't necessarily show it. So, but anyway, I always like Keith, and I'm glad that he's retiring and kick back and hang out, do whatever. But he's a great guy.